Kawa. Pura vida, mi gente. Much love and respect. Thanks for tuning in once again. Today, we're just going to go ahead and continue reading this very interesting book here. It's called History of America Before Columbus, according to documents and approved authors by P. de Rue, member of the Archaeological Club of the Land Van Ways and of the United States Catholic Historical Society, honorary member of the American Catholic Historical Society of Philadelphia. This is volume 1 from 1900. All right. And today we're going to continue where we left off. And we go to page 117, and we are in chapter 5 now of this book. And it says here, Notions of America in Ancient Greece. All right. Very interesting book. We already got past videos letting us know that the so-called ancient Greeks, of course, they knew about the so-called Americas, or as they called it, Atlantis. All right. We're getting more drop from this book now, and it says here, the Phoenician, Sanconiaton, who after Moses is the oldest of all known historians and lived 20 or 22 centuries before Christ, not only heard of the continent lying beyond the Atlantic Ocean, but seems to have been well acquainted with its inhabitants. All right. So again, be ready to dodge any hijack from this author. He tries to throw in the out of Asia origin, even though he's saying civilization literally started here. So, and also their chronology, right? They're saying before Christ. He could have been a lot sooner. But anyways, let's keep going. So this guy knew about, America, as they're saying, and the inhabitants, the American Indians, right? The ancient American Indians. In the few pages of his works, preserved by the quotations of subsequent authors, he tells of the cosmogony of the Atlantides and of the doctrine of man's first appearance on earth. He relates the fratricidal war of two sons of their first deified man and the marriage of their Uranus with Tethys, his sister, and speaks with his praise of their sciences and arts. Now, guys, if you've been watching me record the other book that we've been reading, Researches into the Lost History of America, basically he was talking about this. He showed that the Atlantides and all this, Uranus and all this, was always talking about the Americas. He did quote the same guy, Sanconiaton, in that book. So same thing. Look what they're doing. More corroboration, letting you know they were talking about the Americas. Okay. To the Phoenicians, thus also he learned geographer von Humboldt traced back the knowledge of our Western continent's existence, which we find repeatedly and with a certain uniformity expressed, he says, even through the most remote centuries. He doubts whether the ocean route to Plutarch's great continent had been determined by the Phoenicians' real discoveries of the New World or by their fanciful imagination. Now again, seen in reverse, so-called Phoenicians, not really like a nation, more like seafarers, sea peoples, right? Seafaring peoples. And it included a lot of different peoples, including Israelites. But remember, Phoenicians coming out of Canaan, the real Holy Land, we're just talking about the Americas. They're seeing it in reverse. So of course, so-called Phoenicians knew about America. We could hardly admit the latter supposition when we reflect that the highway between Europe and America, as described at the time of Christ, had been during long historic periods frequented by the ships of either hemisphere, as we shall point out more clearly hereafter. All right? And here we go again. Remember what we've already learned? If anybody, and this is from another book, another author, and this is from a historian of navigation, or an expert in navigation history, that if anybody was to cross the Atlantic first, it would have been an American Indian. Remember, the currents are in our favor, a lot stronger. The winds are in our back. It's 4 times harder to come the other way around. So yes, definitely, in ancient times, we agree, people were traversing the Atlantic back and forth, trading and all that. It is the true old world, okay? It is not unlikely that Phoenician vessels passing by the regular trade posts of the Scilly Islands have struck the American coast. And nothing but our invisible ignorance prevents us from surmising the existence of a regular intercourse between the two continents at the time and before Sanconiatum. All right, back and forth. This is the origin, though. It is quite natural that the cosmographical sciences of the ancient commercial nation should have spread from Tyre and Sidon to Memphis and Egypt. All right, this is Egypt. So, what Memphis are you talking about? Now, remember what we learned yesterday about the copper, the Michigan copper being brought to Europe, going across the Atlantic, creating the Bronze Age. So, of course, we're just corroborating. We already know this. So, he's saying in Egypt, fake Egypt, but it was actually here. They're talking about when they're talking about ancient Egypt, where the sacerdotal castes carefully recorded in their sacred temple books all useful or interesting information, and to Athens in Greece, once of all, the world the most flourishing center of advanced literature. But geographical knowledge of foreign countries has always been proportioned to the business relations with them, all right, the trade. And as Greece entertained no practical intercourse with America, it is easily understood that the cosmography, here we go with the zodiacs, now cosmography, cosmogony, just like in the other book, Researches into the Lost History of America, and the history of our continent never received any great attention from its people, while also the Phoenicians' geographical knowledge grew narrower and dimmer as special circumstances restricted and put an end to their distant voyages. Yet all the early writers of Greece professed their belief in the existence of certain regions situated in the west beyond the bounds of their actual knowledge. And it is evident that the tales of Homer, far from being arbitrary, were founded on very ancient and widely diffused traditions of almost obliterated truth. Remember, Homer and the Odyssey and all that, they were talking about these people traveling to these mythical places. That was the Americas. We got that drop already. Homer, who composed the two masterpieces of ancient poetry, 900, according to some chronologists, or according to others, 1400 years before Christ, placed the Elysium on the western verge of the earth, right? The Elysium, that was the Americas. Again, we got this drop in the other book by another author, another researcher. The home of the heroes, right? Or the titans, exempt from death, where life is easiest to man, right? The paradise, the terrestrial paradise, where life is easiest to man. We're just talking about ancient America, so-called Atlantis. No snow is there, nor yet great storm nor rain, but ocean always sendeth forth the breeze of the shrill west to blow cool on men. He has left a picture of the easy, indolent, and altogether happy life of America's equatorial natives, graphically describing the Elysian plain, situated at the extremity of the western sea, where under a serene sky the favorite of Jove, you're saying Jehovah or Hova, Jehovah, exempt from the common lot of mortals, enjoy eternal felicity, right? People live the longest, huh? Because of the good food and everything, right? The good medicine, the natural, living, the happy. Some writers conclude with less certainty from Homer's epopee that he was not ignorant of the pitiable tribes, who then, as now, inhabited the Arctic regions of our continent. Homer says Cooley makes Ulysses reach past the isle of Aeolus, a race of cannibals. The hero crosses the ocean and comes at last to the ends of it, where the Cimmerians dwell, wrapped in profound gloom, for they see neither the rising nor the setting sun, and the veil of night is constantly spread above them, all right? Like the Arctic circles, where, you got 6 months of darkness, 6 months of light throughout the year, and that's very interesting. In my Sumerian videos, I did say, what if the Sumerians were coming from the Arctic? What if people were traveling? Because they tell us people couldn't travel up there. But I always thought, what if they were actually coming from the Arctic? And that would link you to the Americas. It's right across. It's right there, really. If you're traveling the Arctic, you literally have easy travel to the Americas from Europe and Asia. For they see neither the rising, again, of the sun nor the setting of the sun. Homer had heard of the ocean and Cimmeria In the west, Sumeria, this is what I was saying about so-called Sumerians, not a real nation, but the Sumerians were considered a real nation in the west. So Sumeria was actually in the west, huh? But he knew not how far off they were. Homer's, and then this Greek word right here, may perhaps be identified with the Cimbri of Tacitus and Ptolemy. So the Sumerians are the Cimbri. You know, we kind of got that in my Sumerians video. And found in the misty, gloomy regions of northwestern Germany. But his Elysium could not well be removed from American territory. In like manner does Hesiod, a Greek poet of the 9th century before Christ, locate the happy isles, the abode of departed heroes beyond the dark deep ocean. All right, these mythical lands, right? Happy isles, Americas. Those who have the courage to remain steadfast, thrice in each life, and to keep their souls all together from wrong, Pindar sang, pursue the road of Jupiter to the castle of Saturn in the northeastern parts of America, all right? Where over the isles of the blessed, ocean breezes flow and flowers gleam with gold, some of the land on glycerin trees, or glycerin, sorry, while others the water feeds, and with bracelets of these they entwine their hands and make crowns for their heads. The islands of the blessed were never lost to human memory, nor to literature, until the latest discovery of the Western continent. All right? They remained for the Celtic and other European nations until their conversion to Christianity, the longed for home of happier life hereafter. All right? The Celtics and all these Western people and the British Isles and a lot of European nations, they always knew about the Americas, possibly about the original home, right? Where's Greater Island or Great Ireland? I mean, we got the drop. Again, if anybody was to cross the Atlantic first, it would have been American Indians or people from ancient America, right? Always apply that. Remember, so it correlates with what he's saying here. They always knew it was there, the longed for home of a happier life hereafter. These happy isles in the immediate vicinity of our continent, if not the South American mainland itself, were visited 800 years before the Christian era by the celebrated navigator Hanno. If we may believe his, and that's the name of his book probably, in which it is stated that after having passed the Pillars of Hercules, or Strait of Gibraltar, and having left the African coast, he sailed directly to the west for the space of 30 days, and then met with land. All right, so again, you can't discover a place that already had people. So yeah, people probably came from the west coast of Europe, west coast of Africa, but that doesn't mean they were the ones first to do it or they discovered it. There was already people there. And we're talking about this so-called Greek that's an African. Greek, right? America's northern parts, suggested by Homer's land of the Sumerians, are more clearly, though confusedly, still indicated by a relatively recent writer, namely by Plutarch, who during the 1st century of our era relates in his dialogue the Phasis in Orbi Lunae, or the face of the moon's disk, what the learned consider to be traditions of most ancient Greek mythology, and should therefore find a place among the testimonies of the oldest writers. The island Ogygia, says Plutarch, and remember Ogygia and the other book, is proven it by the zodiac, the constellation, and the stories that it was in the Americas, lies at a distance of 5 days' navigation west of Great Britain, and farther in the same direction of the summer setting sun, or west-northwest. At equal distances of 3 more days' voyages are situated 3 other islands, in one of which Jupiter has imprisoned and chained with the bonds of an everlasting sleep his conquered antagonist, the god Saturn. Farther still at 5,000 stadia from Ogygia, but closer to the last of the other islands, is located the great mysterious continent that encompasses the ocean. The Cronian Sea, remember Kronos, Cronian Sea, Kronos, we're just talking about the Atlantic, which here forms a gulf as large as the Caspian Lake, It's so smooth and shallow, so full of mud, of sandbanks and reefs that it would be impossible to cross it but in rowing vessels. Of old, it was thought, he adds, that this sea was all frozen. Now remember, during the time of Plato and all these people, they couldn't cross the Atlantic. They said it was full of mud. Something had happened. That's why they start their Atlantis story, saying, in the days of Atlantis, the Atlantic Ocean was navigable, meaning in their time it wasn't. So there was a separation for a while, an isolation of the Americas from these people. And that's why probably a lot of the time it became myth or just legends. But they're saying it also supposedly was frozen here. And they wrote that supposedly, right? And he's got the source. So that's Plutarch, and the book, you guys know what Plutarch wrote, stretched much farther to the north than the eastern continent. His own, I mean, you see the Greek words here, if you guys know how to interpret that, but just look up what the Plutarch wrote, and that's what he's talking about. We got that on the other book. And its inhabitants pretend that their country was the world's mainland. Again, the world's mainland, where in the Americas, the mainland, the oldest land, the origin, the center, mainland, while they call us islanders. So the Greeks were just islanders compared to America that was considered the mainland, says the Charonian philosopher Plutarch. Plutarch is saying that because we are surrounded by the ocean. This last remark, simple as it may appear, is fraught with conclusions of such an interesting nature that a student will readily forego chronological order in search of confirmation of Plutarch's statement, which indeed we find already expressed by the Roman orator. All right, so you gotta kind of step out of the modern chronology they put on us, and that makes sense because chronology is not real. I mean, it's not that it's not real, but it's a little false the way they gave it to us. It's not correct. So he's saying a Roman guy already said this too, Cicero, who admitted a second inhabited continent, interpreted by Macrobius in the beginning of the 5th century after Christ as corresponding with North and South America. All right, so could that have been actually in the Middle Ages he wrote that? Remember my chronological videos, Anatoly Fomenko. All right, places in the mouth of its people the boosting words, all the land inhabited by you is but a small island. Omnis enim terra qua cilitor evos parva quadem insula est. This expression of national pride and probably a physical truth was recorded centuries before by an author who probably was not the first to repeat an opinion which belonged to the system of Hellenic legends. Of the highest antiquity, says the learned von Humboldt, all right, Alexander von Humboldt, of the works of Theopompus, who wrote in the 4th century before Christ, some important fragments were preserved by Strabo, and in the Varie Historia, or various histories of Aelianus Claudius, in which the original author likewise asserts that Europe, Asia, and Libya, listen, are but islands surrounded by the ocean, beyond which lies a continent of immense magnitude. All right, so it must have been a lot more bigger, the Americas, before whatever happened, parts of it went down, right? So-called Atlantis. The judicious editor Perisonius remarks on the occasion of this statement that the ancients have doubtless, as through a dark cloud, seen something of America by means of Egyptian and Carthaginian traditions, and by reasoning on the form and location of our globe. But it is hardly probable that the ancient theory in regard to the relative extent of both landed hemispheres should, in spite of all these authors' narratives, be credited to scientists of the Old World. If it is thus a rational conclusion that aboriginal American geographers, instructed the learned of the other hemisphere, listen, brought the knowledge from America to these people, this is what they're saying here. In the world's universal cosmography, we are entitled to propose two not impertinent and important questions. What grounds did ancient Americans have to assert that their continent was, the mainland, or the real center by antonomasia, or by antonomasia, the continent of the world, the true old world, or the oldest land, right? The original land coming out of the waters, the continent of the world. We're talking about Pangea. Before it started breaking off, most of it was still in America. Huh? Had they lived at the epoch in which the slow third motion of the Earth allowed them a favorable temperature to explore the vast regions of the North Pole and to establish what is still suggested by the eastern shores of Greenland, John Mayen, and Spitsbergen Islands, that our continent formed an immense half moon around the Old World, and to a great extent justified the bold reports of ancient European geographers, right? And he makes a point there. So how could Americans say, "Oh, you guys are just islands compared to ours, the mainland, the real continent of the world"? That means they would have to have traveled already to all the world to make sure of that, to verify that, to be so confident in that statement. And that's what did happen. That's what we've been showing all these years here. America's a true old world. We had ships going out. Remember, Michigan copper is what created the Bronze Age. Huh. Corn, where all these people get their corn from, huh? We leave the answer to this former complex interrogation to the hardy explorers who, in our own days, braved the increasing difficulties of northern discoveries, and we put the latter question, intimated by the foregoing statement, and pertaining more directly to historical science, namely, how did the ancient Americans know that the old world is but an island duly surrounded by water? How did they know that? So-called old world, right? That's the new world. If this is the main continent or the mainland, this is the true old world, right? But how would they know that? There can be only two ways of explaining this strange fact. The learned, listen, American aborigines must either have received their chorographic information from their ancestors who immigrated from the eastern insular, or themselves, that's the one, have crossed the ocean stream, surveyed the eastern hemisphere, or at least have come in contact with its pristine, better geographers, right? That's what they did. Ancient Americans went out exploring the world and populating a lot of the places outside of the America, the true old world, the oldest land coming out of the primordial waters. This latter explanation might have the appearance of a daring assumption. Still, there is no scarcity of good reasons for its logical support. We have noticed already the probable immigration into northwestern Europe by both the American kitchen middens and the mound builders, right? Not just them, but you guys hear him, right? He has it already. He has it already set on his mind that hey, we know that these people went over there, so why not more ancient Americans going over to Europe and Asia, right? Plutarch adds in his dialogue of the face on the moon's disk that primitive Americans regularly made a voyage to European parts every 30 years. Primitive Americans going over there, not the other way around. All right, are you guys listening? Empty your cups. All right, how many more books again do I have to read? All these authors telling you the same thing, yet they want to say, oh, they must have come from Asia before that. This is Asia, the farthest east. Asia Major, India Superior, one of the three Indias, the main one, Superior. So every 30 years, he says, when the planet Saturn, which we call, in that Greek word, and day, or night watch, enters the sign of Taurus, the inhabitants of Cronian continent, Chronos, remember what we learned in research into the lost history of America, Chronos is from here, is a geography pertaining to America. So the inhabitants of the Cronian continent, more corroboration, dispatch certain representatives called Oceanades, is that the Oceanades, to be present at the feast which take place on the occasion in the island of Ogygia. The mission of these envoys was a dangerous character. Their first destination was the islands which we just mentioned, as lying opposite the great continent, inhabited by a race of Greek origin, thus the hijack, so-called Greek, among whom Hercules had restored the language and customs of the mother country, says Plutarch. Here, for 30 days, the sun will not be hitting more than 1 hour, and during this short night, there would be light sufficient to catch lice, as the monk Dicul afterwards put it. It is necessary to observe that this particular is indicative of Greenland or Iceland. After a sojourn of 90 days in these boreal regions, the American delegates availed themselves of the first favorable wind to set sail again for the end of their voyage. And again, corroborating with what historian of navigation said, it's easier to go that way. We got the Gulf Stream and the wind on our back, favorable winds. If anybody was to cross the Atlantic, it would have been American Indians, okay? Lamprias heard all these interesting details from Scylla, who had received them from a stranger arrived in Carthage from the Saturnian Islands. So all these names were the Americas, right? Saturnian Islands. The Greek colonies of the northern isles are questionable. Indeed, and we may have our doubts as to the regular visits of Americans to the dubious islands of Ogygia. Yet it would be hypercritical to reject Plutarch's authority altogether. Von Humboldt does not deny that mythological reports of pristine information have exercised a great influence upon the positive geographical science of classic Greece and Rome. A lot of that mythology is based on truth, a science which, when rightly understood, is as respectable for its relative accuracy as for its antiquity. And he seems to admit that Chironian philosophers' statements were founded on the reports of Atlantic Ocean sailors, all right, no less than on Greek ancient traditions. Whichever the grounds of Plutarch's statements may be, the statements themselves singularly agree with geographical realities, talking about real places. His equidistant islands are clearly the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland. And already Greenland is right next to us, you know. His gulf, large as the Caspian Sea, corresponds with the waters that stretch out between Cape Farewell and Labrador. The difficulties and dangers encountered there remind us of the obstacles and perils that beset navigation in those regions today. And his description of Iceland or Greenland summer nights is evidence that the Cronian Sea had been plowed by Mediterranean vessels. The Cronian Sea, which is towards America, so-called Mediterranean. These topographic remarks lead us to incidentally notice that the name of one of America's principal boundaries, the Atlantic Ocean, quite familiar to later writers such as Diodorus of Sicily, Strabo, and Pliny, was mentioned already in the 5th century before Christ by Euripides and Herodotus. And thus the name of where they mention it. If just now we paid attention, if only we paid attention to what was really being said, and these teachers were not misinterpreting the history or the mythology and just saying, oh, that's just myths, people's imagination. If only we paid attention to the worth of Plutarch's evidence in regard to American ancient history, we ought to be more particular in discussing the credibility of an author, much more important on account of both his greater antiquity and the larger amount of his interesting information. Solon is quoted sometimes as a writer barren on the history of our continent, but the testimony which we may have inherited from him has come to us through the pen of Plato or Aristoteles, right? Who wrote at the beginning of the 4th century before our era. The authenticity of Plato's writings is beyond all question, nor was there ever any doubt raised as to the credibility of the great philosopher's statements. But owing likely to the ignorance of the scientists of our era, the ignorance or the gatekeeping, I would say is more gatekeeping, who were not sufficiently prepared to receive his lore regarding our continent, those of his works that treat of America All right, remember, he's talking about Plato. Plato talked about Atlantis. I'm going to tell you, this is Atlantis. Have been subject to the most widely different interpretations. The famous humanist Marsilio Ficino remarks already that some writers before him, the Syrian Porphyrios, Proclus, and even Origen, considered Plato's Timaeus and Critias as allegorical compositions, and Conrad Krishmer adduced quite lately Strabo and the Neoplatonists as authorities for his own opinion, namely, that Plato's description of the Atlantis is a myth. Huh. The great geographer von Humboldt is reserved in expressing his opinion, yet he seems inclined to believe that the Athenian philosopher has spoken of the Atlantis as of a known reality. America's ancient name in Europe was certainly no new invention of Plato, okay, who, no matter what the source of his information may have been, had evidently learned of the Western world, of the continent, from the writings of his predecessors. The information which he received in regards to our hemisphere from the ancient savants can hardly leave a doubt that Plato's Critias is, if not a strictly historical account, a relation, at least founded on fact and historical truth. It is no wonder if suspicions of allegory and fiction should have arisen during the centuries in which the knowledge of America's very existence had almost vanished from Europe. But at all times, and especially as science increased, have the learned considered the great philosopher as an adept of ancient American history, okay? All right, so remember, talking about Plato, right? Plato, Atlantis, right? But here he's just calling it America, American history, not Atlantean, American history. Not to speak of other ancient authors, to whom we shall refer in the sequel. We may remark that the Jewish writer Philo, 20 BC to 54 AD, he might be actually from the Middle Ages, and the Platonist Crantor were inclined to admit the literal interpretation of Plato's Atlantidic description. Tertullian, 2nd century AC, and Arnobius, 4th century AC, again, all these so-called Greeks might be in the Middle Ages, agreed with the pagan savant Ammianus Marcellinus, 3rd century AC, in admitting the former existence of Plato's island, Atlantis. And we have noticed that Cosmas Indicopletus believed our continent to be the cradle of the human race. Come on now, body bag for the illusion. Yo, shout out to Drop, yo. Shout out to Drop. Come on now, America, the cradle of human race. I've been trying to tell you this. This was written in 1900, but how many books are going to keep telling you, all these researchers, when they really start breaking down the real history, the mythology, what is really saying? Like this, he's saying that this guy Cosmas Indicopletus literally said that America was the cradle of the human race, the beginning, the origin, the center. It's not about no just Pangea, it was all connected. Yeah, so what? There was still an origin, there's still a center to that so-called Pangea. It would not be difficult to find several authors of the first Christian centuries and of the Middle Ages, again, Middle Ages, who relied on Plato's narrative in their prophecies of discoveries in the mysterious West. And Christopher Columbus himself, all right, Salvador Fernandez Sarco himself was undoubtedly, the Portuguese Jew, right, was undoubtedly encouraged by his belief in the objective truth of Plato's Timaeus and Critias. Come on, Christopher Columbus, so-called, right? He knew about Atlantis, America. He knew it was there. But after our continent was again discovered at the end of the 15th century, almost every European scientist accepted the literal interpretation of the Athenian philosopher's description of countries in and beyond the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so imagine that when they finally came back, people from Europe, or made it public to everybody else, because they were going back and forth already, right? Can you imagine all the people who doubted Plato there? Now they were like, whoa, it was true. There is a continent there larger than Libya and Asia, as Plato described it. We're not talking about a little place in Mauritania. Come on, guys, wake up. Stop being so biased. Wake up. Suffice it to mention, among many others, Ortelius and Mercator, who believed that America is the ancient Atlantis. Again, Ortelius and Mercator, right, who wrote literally on his map, he put India on top of America. He literally put India on top of America, who believed that America is the ancient Atlantis. I told you it's not just me saying it. We are in Atlantis. Not all of it sank. As also did the contemporaries Gomara, Father Jose de Acosta, and Las Casas. Come on, guys. All these people were saying, this is Atlantis. We found it. Who writes a whole chapter on Plato's Atlantis as being America. Okay? Las Casas. De Las Casas. He's saying, yeah, this is the one Plato was talking about. This is Atlantis. It's America. Of the same opinion were William de Postel, who sustained Plato's statements by Mexican etymology. Wifliet, Bacon of Verulam, Pluver, who thought that Plato's narratives was due to geographical knowledge of America. All these people were saying the same thing, but they never told us this. George Horn and the Swiss Bicherodus, who concluded a lengthy discussion in favor of the literal interpretation of Plato. Literal. It was America. At the end of the 17th century, Nicholas and William Sanson published a map of America with the name Atlantis Island. All right, guys, and I've shown you this already. I've shown you this map. William Sanson, he literally put Atlantis Island on the American continent. Man, go get the drop again, guys. Catch up if you're new to my channel. And if you don't remember, guys, you guys got to go back. If you already saw the video and you don't remember, go back. Let's restudy. Let's put it all together. You see how it's coming all together? I didn't expect to be reading this. This is the first time I read this with you guys. I mean, come on now. Divided among the 10 heirs of Atlas, and Robert of Vagondy after them gives the title of Old World to the delineation of our Western Hemisphere. Okay, Robert knew the drop. Robert had the drop. He knew this was the true Old World. The Western Hemisphere. He knew this was the true Old World. People still want to debate me. They think I'm just making up things and it's just my theories. Oh, your theory, Kurimeo. I don't know if I agree with your theories. What you mean, my theories? I didn't write these books. I'm not De Las Casas. I'm not William Sanson. I'm not Robert of Burgundy. Stahlbaum, in his learned edition of Plato's work, and Paul Gaffaro are effective defenders still of the old philosopher's knowledge of the American continent. Now, you see how many people already knew this? You think Columbus didn't know where he was going? So-called Columbus, Sarko, Salvador Sarko. The infidel Bailey wrote to his incredulous friend, de Voltaire. Plato, when yet a child, listened to his grandfather Critias, then 90 years old, who when young had been taught by Solon, a friend of his father. The report is, therefore, based on a clear and well-defined tradition, nor can there be a more sacred source of history, more deserving of our confidence. All right? That was what Bailey was saying. He's like, hey, come on, man. He's just passing down his oral tradition. They knew. Our erudite historian Windsor declares Plato's Atlantis to be a myth, but the reader of his learned discussion is strongly influenced by the arguments and authorities set forth to believe as truthful and correct the contrary opinion. So even though he was calling it a myth, he actually proved it was America, or Atlantis was real. It may please our readers to see the venerable source of Plato's information exposed to them in its original simplicity and purity. Okay? Hermocrates, he, Critias, has told us what he has heard long ago, and I wish, Critias, that you would tell it now over again. Critias, I shall do so. if it pleases also our third companion, Timos. And Timaeus says, it pleases me, of course. Critias, hear then, O Socrates, a history very strange, indeed, yet altogether true, as it once was told by Solon, the wisest of the seven wise. Solon was familiar with, and a fast friend of Doropidas, our great grandfather, as he himself often states in his Psalms. Now he had to our grandfather Critias, as the old man relates to us in his turn, that great and wonderful had been the ancient deeds of the city of Athens, although obliterated now by long ages, and the ruins of nations, and one especially the greatest of all, which it behooves to recite now. We may be allowed to insert here a remark of the scholarly Marsilio Ficino. The story here told is no fiction, but a history, he says. First, because Plato is used to give the name of a fable to whatever he invents, while here he assures us that his report is historical, as he also states in his Timaeus, where he warns the reader not to disbelieve the facts because of their wonderfulness. Second, because he is most careful in describing the plain source of his own information. In fact, he continues thus, Socrates, you say well, but what then is the exploit which Critias has narrated after Solon's authority? Critias says, I will tell the ancient recital as I heard it when a boy. Critias was at the time, as he said, already close to 90 years of age, and I was about 10 years old, and I remember perfectly well. Oh, Aminander had Solon completed the history, which he imported here from Egypt. What Egypt? Ancient America. That's why Solon knew. I am of the opinion that neither Hesiod, nor Homer, nor any other poet would have become more renowned than he. We must observe that Plato's Critias, or description of Atlantis, is not a finished work. Did he stop his narrative where Solon stopped before him? Here someone interrupted the slow old man by saying, but what then is that history, O Critias? Tell it us all from the beginning, said he. What and how Solon narrated it, and by whom it was listened to as truth. And then Critias says, there is in Egypt a very large city, Sais, Solon said, that having traveled there, he was highly honored by its inhabitants, and that after having inquired into antiquity from its most experienced priest, he had found out that neither he nor any other Greek knew anything at all, so to say, of ancient lore. He said that one day, to attract them into a conversation upon ancient memories, he commenced to speak of Athens' oldest records, and that one very old priest answered, O Solon, Solon, you Greeks, you are children always. There is not an old man in Greece. Hearing this, Solon asked, how can you say that? He said, you are young of mind. You have not the least idea of antiquity. From ancient reports, no signs at all of olden times. On the contrary, all that is saved the pristine records can be read with us. Anything indeed that has happened with you, or with us, or in any other place, and is reported to us, anything beautiful or grand, or events remarkable for any other reason that have taken place anywhere, all that is old written down and kept in the temples of this country, while O Solon, the genealogies upon which you expatiate, according to your traditions, fall little short of childish tales, all right? He's like, hey, you guys really don't know anything. You guys are like children when it comes to knowing real ancient history. And that's how we are today. A lot of you guys are like children. You only know a little bit, and you're stuck with a childish kind of thinking because you're not getting deep enough, not understanding the true orientation, the true old world, the beginning of all. Same thing. Let it be noticed, in passing by, that the author was aware of the difference between fact and fiction, and that while he reports the arguments of the Egyptian priests to undeceive Solon in regard to Athenian history, he would not likely, a serious philosopher as he is, try to force upon his reader imaginary statements set forth as actual truth regarding an important part of the world. All right, so these so-called Egyptian priests are like, you guys don't know anything. Why would these so-called Egyptian priests know? Where was ancient Egypt, guys? Why is there corn, maize, corn, right, all over their hieroglyphs? Why did they find cocaine in their mummies? Come on, why are all their deities Westerners? Why are all their deities American animals? Come on, let's be logical, break the spell. After having given in his Timaeus the information that he wished to impart, he concludes by the following particulars, which cannot but increase our confidence in his historical truthfulness. Such, O Socrates, are the statements of the older Critias, according to the recitals of Solon, which I have summarized after his rehearsal. For what we have learned in childhood we remember wonderfully well, and I would be altogether surprised if I should have forgotten anything of what I eagerly listened to so long ago. I heard then, with so much pleasure and amusement, the words of the old man who taught me, good heartedly answering my numerous questions, that they remained in my memory, like an indelible and constant writing. I am able, O Socrates, not only to give a summary account, but to narrate the particulars as I heard them. Socrates says, and what other narrative should be preferred to this, which is all the more remarkable for not being an invented myth, but a history absolutely true? In his work, Critias or Atlantis, Plato introduces the same Critias who says, if we shall have remembered rightly and communicated the words once spoken by the priest and brought over here by Solon, it is clear enough, we think, to this company that we shall have sufficiently accomplished our duty. This now should be done at once, and there is no reason to wait any longer. We will now listen to the younger Critias recounting in both Plato's, Timaeus, and Critias what the older had learned from Solon. It is as follows. All right, this is what Critias is saying. Remember, this is an ancestor of Plato. The wise man Solon had been struck at the rebuke of the old priest of Sais, and pressed by all his desire of learning, he begged the priest to enter in a correct and coherent form upon the history of the ancient citizens of Athens. Then the priest said, we are not envious, O Solon, and I will tell you for your sake and for the sake of your city, the annals of this our commonwealth, since 8,000 years are written down in our holy books. The writing states how your city at one time destroyed a power that insolently ran over the whole of both Europe and Asia, and had fiercely rushed forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. All right, ancient Americans running over the whole of both Europe and Asia. And let us first of all recall to mind that it is, in round numbers, 9,000 years since war was declared between those who lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules and all those who inhabited this side. Before relating the catastrophic issue of this struggle, as interesting as gigantic, Critias gives us an almost complete description of our hemisphere and prehistoric times. So Critias says, then, he continues, that ocean, to wit the Atlantic, was navigable, right? Again, it was navigable because in their time it wasn't. They couldn't cross it. It contained an island opposite the mouth which you call, as you say, the Pillars of Hercules. That's the Straits of Gibraltar right there between Spain and Morocco. The island itself was greater than Asia, then known as sample Asia Minor. Asia was called Asia Minor. Guys, pay attention. What we call today Asia was then known as Asia Minor. So where was Asia Major? Where was Greater Asia, huh? That was America and Libya. then known as Berber, right? Talking about North Africa. So again, this island, we're talking about the real continent, talking about the Americas, right? Was bigger than Asia and North Africa. Bigger. So it can't be a small place in Mauritania. Come on. You're not understanding what you're saying when you're asking me, but Kurimeo, it was proven that it was in Mauritania. What do you think about that? I'm like, you're not paying attention to what Plato's saying. Bigger than Asia and North Africa. It's bigger than the Atlantic Ocean itself. From this island, the voyagers at that time had access to the other islands of that ocean, and from these latter islands to the whole great continent lying close beyond them, and around that other sea, the true sea. For the waters like those within the mouth of which we spoke seem to be but small ponds with some inlet, but that the other sea can justly be called the sea, and that land which surrounds it can in all truth be named the continent. All right. So literally describing the Caribbean islands and all these little islands that were near a bigger land, right? That's what he's saying. These latter islands, right? These latter islands to the whole great continent lying close beyond them. So there's a whole continent lying close beyond it. And then when you travel through that continent, you get to the true sea or the true ocean, which is the Pacific Ocean, guys. That's what they're telling you here. You got to break down what they're saying, literally describing the Americas, the Caribbean islands, and all the islands around the Americas, and then crossing that continent, the Americas, you get to the true sea or the Pacific Ocean. These last bold assertions perfectly agree with the statements of ancient Greek mythology as recorded by Plutarch and of Theopompus, and the whole of Plato's system of American geography becomes evident as soon as we admit his following paragraph, the probability, not to say the credibility, of which we will expose farther on. Okay? And they're quoting again. The island Atlantis, now submerged through the effect of earthquakes, has become a region of mud and an obstacle for those who sail from here to reach the high seas. We are not the first, nor are we likely to be the last to admit the concordance between Plato's description and geographical data. Herrera, all right, another of the conquistadors and colonists, Spanish, right, states that many considered Critias' narrow mouth as the Straits of Gibraltar, his ocean as the Atlantic Ocean, his great island as the one existing Atlantis, his farther islands as the Leeward and the Windward Islands or the Caribbeans, right, his great continent, opposite the smaller islands as the Western continent or the America, and finally, his true sea as the South Sea or Pacific Ocean, like I just said earlier, guys. Break it down. I didn't even need to read this. I didn't know somebody had broken it down like how I was picturing it before. All right. Literally, they're breaking it down for you, but nobody paid attention because everybody, oh, that's just a myth. It's all sunk. It's all sunk. It's under the Atlantic. No, man, we're talking about reaching the Pacific. So they're talking about crossing the Americas, right? The Western continent. Acosta and Charlevoix, more colonists, colonial times 1500, 1600, proposed the same interpretation, which since then has obtained more and more credit in the learned world. Plato's statement of the political power of the Atlantis contains a further illustration of his general geography. In this island Atlantis, he says, the kings exercise a great and wonderful power, being the masters of the whole of the island itself, of other islands, and of parts of the continent. Besides that, they were also at the head of the people of Libya, as far as Egypt. So they even ruled North Africa. Listen, the American kings also ruled North Africa, as far as so-called Egypt, or that place they call Egypt today, and of Europe, as far as the Mediterranean Sea. All right, they ruled Europe too. Come on now, listen. Critias further continues by giving a more particular description of the island Atlantis, from which we select a few interesting details. Those kings, he says, in consequence of their authority, received many things imported from without, but the island itself furnished the greater part of their comforts of life, all right, all the resources. Yeah, they got some imports, but most of the stuff was from there. All right? The Americas, the terrestrial paradise. And first, all the solid metals. Listen, all the solid metals that are dug out from the mines and all those that are fusible, besides that, which we now only know by name, but was then abundantly dug out from the bowels of the earth in many places of that island. Come on, now they're talking about metals here: gold, silver, copper, iron. Come on. Uh, oh man, you guys know lead. You guys know this is the true, resourceful, original terrestrial paradise. All the metals, right? We just read yesterday how Michigan copper created the Bronze Age. Come on, man. Namely, the species of metal designated as auricald, the most precious, with the exception of gold and the estimation of the people of those times. The forest affords all that is necessary for architectural purposes. Listen, even the trees, the abundance of wood, and the prairies yields abundantly what is required for the food of both domestic and wild animals. The food, again, 600 out of 640 food crops in Africa originated in the Americas, guys. Corn feeds the world alone. This is the true terrestrial paradise. Wake up, the oldest land would have that. The oldest land would have that. Remember, Noah built his ship from gopher wood. Gopher wood grows in Florida, Georgia, and South America. There is also on the island a very large species of elephants. All right, I told you we had elephants. Elephants abundantly here, and the ancestor of elephants. The bones are being found all over the Americas. Different types of elephants. They went from here to over there. And there is food for all other animals that live in the marshes, by the lakes, and along the rivers, as well as for all those that roam on the mountains and on the plains. There are also great numbers of the largest and most voracious beast. All right? Come on now. The great numbers of all these animals, right? They call them voracious beast. Abundance here in the Americas. And this is Critias, right? It's telling you, ancient so-called Greeks and ancestors to Plato. Besides all that, there are all the odoriferous plants that the earth produces anywhere today. They have all the plants that we can produce today, all the plants. Its soil brings forth all that pertains to roots, to cereals, to wood, to distilling juices, to flowers or fruits, and it all thrives well. Again, the true terrestrial paradise, guys. You see all the food coming out of here, the resources, minerals. Come on now. That's the Most High. That's a true holy land. Milk and honey. Milk and honey, right? All the roots. We're talking about fertile land. The soil, he's saying, the soil. We're talking about rich, black, fertile land. Soil. Rich, black, fertile soil. Kemet. That's what Kemet means. Rich, fertile, black soil. It further yields cultivated and dry fruit, which we use as victuals, and all the rest that is used for food, and whose various species we generally call vegetables. He's literally saying we got all our stuff from there. There are also to be found all the trees that produce beverage, eatables, unguents, as well as for the sake of fun and pleasure, the shell fruits, such as chestnuts that are hard to preserve, and all the sweet meats loved by the working man, which we put up to fully satisfy our appetite, even all the meats. Come on now, like, wow, this is amazing reading this. I never really read this much detail into Critias' work, honestly, guys, explaining the abundance of the Americas, the true terrestrial paradise. Wake up, you're standing on it. The island that once in those days had existence under the sun, holy, beautiful, again, holy land, true holy land, beautiful and admirable as it was, brought forth all these things in infinite abundance. Again, an infinite abundance, abundance, terrestrial paradise, abundance. Other ancient authors speak equally well of America, But what these do not say, let us continue to hear from Critias. So Critias continues saying, gathering all those riches from the earth, he adds, they erected the temples and the royal residences and the ports and the navy yards and improved all the rest of the country. Listen, one after another, inheriting the beautiful structures, always excelled his predecessor as best he could until their dwelling place looked admirable for both the greatness and the beauty of their works. Just like Marco Polo's, it's described when he went to the far disease, right? He came to the Americas, magnificent temples, right? All the pyramids, all the structures here, the megalithic, and even the stuff they tore down, all the castles and palaces that they say they built much later, right? He's letting you know it was all right here. We could not afford to copy here all the details of Plato's lengthy description of the capital city, but we should not overlook the picture he draws of its great temple, the royal buildings. He says, within the fortress were erected in this manner. There, in the center, stood apart the sacred, inaccessible temple of the goddess Cleton and of the god Neptune. Where is that? He's saying in the Americas, the temple of Neptune. We already got this. Come on, we got this in other books. Surrounded with an enclosure of gold, within which in the beginning was engendered and born the dynasty of the 10 kings. Come on now. The Titans, the 10 kings of Atlantis, and where, coming together from the 10 provinces, they offered yearly sacrifices in honor of each of them. Neptune's temple was one stadium, 607 English feet in length and 300 feet wide. Its height was in proportion to its other dimensions, but its front had a somewhat barbaric appearance. The entire outside of the temple was covered with silver, with the exception of the roofs, which were overlaid with gold. As for the interior, the ceiling was of ivory, variegated with gold and chalk, and all the rest, walls, columns, and pavements were covered with orichalk. All right, just picture how they draw Wakanda in the Marvel movies. That was here in the Americas. Wakanda is a Native American word, American indigenous word for the Great Spirit, omnipotent, or supernatural. The statues they erected were of gold statues. That of the god was standing on a chariot, holding the reins of 6-winged steeds, and so tall as to touch the very ceiling. Around it were 100 nereids riding their dolphins. For such at the time people thought their number to be, and many other statues of private individuals were placed nearby. Around the temple, on the outside, were standing the golden images of all the women and of all the men who had descended from the 10 kings, and many other great monuments, both of kings and of private individuals, of the city itself, and of all the provinces under its rule. There was an altar there also, which in size and workmanship corresponded with the edifice itself, and the royal buildings near by were in proportion to the greatness of the empire and to the beauty of the sacred edifices. All right, so just picture Teotihuacan too in the island. You guys saw that image I showed of what they did. They did a replica of what it probably looked like, and it was magnificent. I picture this, what they're talking about right now. It is not necessary to expatiate on the bridges of the city, on its aqueducts, baths, gymnasia, and racetracks, which its people had built for usefulness and sport. But we should not neglect to notice that its dockyards were full of trirmes and of the apparel that pertains to them, and it was all rigged up in good shape. In the neighborhood of the port were living a multitude of people, and numerous houses built closely together. The haven and the largest port were filled with ships. All right, ships. Merchants. Who's the merchants? Who's the OG merchants? Arrived from all parts. And day and night one could hear on every side the voices and shouting and bustle of the throngs. So literally, whoever's describing this, even though Plato's getting the story from his ancestor, whoever told them that the so-called Egyptians, right, they were there. There's only one way they would be able to describe it so much in details because they were in the Americas. The whole country is said to have been very high and cut abruptly from the ocean. But the district about the city is all a plain that surrounds the city and is itself encircled down to the sea by low mountains. It is smooth and level, of an oblong shape, measuring to its other end 3,000 stadia, that is, 358 miles, and about its middle from the sea upward 2,000 or 238 miles. As regard the whole island, it stretches toward the west, with its mountain exposed to the north, and in these mountains it has many and rich agglomerations of neighbors. Did the Atlantis of Plato extend from the Madeira Islands to Cuba? I would say it did. And are the Azores or Flemish Islands its northern mountaintops? Learned men, as von Humboldt and Maltebrum, accuse Solon and Plato of inconsistency or contradiction in their statements of the size of Atlantis. Once they say declared greater than Asia and Africa together. It was that big. The Americas alone, just the continent, right, is that big. And once set forth as being 2,000 by 3,000 stadia. But these authors, in all other respects, of the highest authority, must have but superficially read Plato's Critias, where the surveyor clearly distinguishes between the whole island and the plain that lay around its capital. Quadrilateral as it was in the main rectangular and oblong, but it lost its shape by the digging round about it of a trench, the statement of whose depth, width, and length is simply incredible when this is compared with all other works of human hands. We're talking about mounds and trenches and come on now, trench, mounds, dirt trenches. It was established that the ballot should designate each officer among the men of the plain who were fit for war, and the total number of the ballots amounted to 60,000. But it is said that the number of the inhabitants of the mountains and of the other parts was simply infinite. Critias describes also the government of the prehistoric Western Empire. We must now acquaint you with the government of these enemies of our city, as it was established from the beginning, and if we have not lost our memory, according to what we heard when yet a child, for with you our friends that knowledge ought to be in common. Now then, Neptune, having by the casting of lots obtained the Atlantis, Neptune, casting of lots, Noah, established there his progeny, born from a mortal woman in some place of the island. He raised 5 male twins, and having divided the whole island Atlantis into 10 parts, he assigned to the firstborn or the oldest, Atlas, by name, the maternal home and country around it, which was the largest and the best, and established him king of the others, whom he made governors, giving to each one the government of many people and of much country. All these and their descendants lived there during many generations, reigning over numerous other islands of the ocean, even over the inhabitants on this side of the Pillars of Hercules, as far as Egypt and the Tyrrhenian Sea, as we have said before. All right, they even ruled literally almost the whole world. King of kings, right? The land of Prester John, King of kings, and this Atlantic lineage waxed numerous and otherwise honorable, and acquired such an abundance of riches as never before was in the possession of any other kings, and will not easily be hereafter. Anything they might want was procured to them, whether in the city or in another part of the country. Their relative power and mutual association were regulated by the orders of Neptune, which were set forth to them by the law and by the jurisprudence of their forefathers, written down on a column of chalk and a temple of Neptune about the center of the island. They therefore assembled alternately every 5th and every 6th year, allowing to all, whether equals or superiors, an equal share in the deliberations. And when gathered together, they maturely considered what belonged to their common interests, examined whether any one had become guilty of trespass, and rendered justice. When on the point of sitting in judgment, they first gave security to one another in the following manner. A number of steers having been let loose in the temple of Neptune, the 10 of them, but each one by himself alone, made vow to the god to catch for him an acceptable victim, and commenced the chase without a lance, armed only with sticks and lassos. Whichever steer they laid hold on they brought to the column and killed it on the column's top according to the written legislation. There existed many other laws for each one of the kings in regard to things sacred, but the holiest of all was never to carry arms against one another, but each was obliged to assist all others in case that anybody should undertake to destroy their kingly race in any city whatever. Having as their predecessors deliberated in common about the measures relating to war and all other public affairs, they gave the leadership to Atlas' descendants. Before proceeding any farther, we should stop a moment here to reflect on the kind of sacrifice offered up to Neptune in prehistoric America, where, in prehistoric America, it consisted of animals slaughtered in honor of the apparently one god. The advanced civilization of the ancient Atlantides was thus free from the degrading human sacrifices. They weren't sacrificing humans, you guys hear that? Which afterwards polluted our continent during so many centuries. Yeah, the hijacks came in and took over. Material welfare, arts, and sciences walked hand in hand with philosophy and religion, either comparatively or absolutely pure. The Greek philosopher had no knowledge of the Hebrew records of man's creation and of his original divine worship, but we cannot fail to see the close resemblance of his Neptune with the Almighty God. Listen, just like the Hebrews, of his mortal woman with our first mother, of his Atlantidic sacrifices with those of Abel, and of his arts and general welfare in the distant west with those of Adam's immediate descendants. Okay? All right? Listen to what he's telling you here. By so far is all this true that we venture to surmise that typical Christianity was the first religion of American nations. Dodge the hijack. This supposition derives no inconsiderable weight from the following further statements, replete with matter for serious reflection. Critias continues, for many generations, as long as the nature of the god lasted in them, they were obedient to the laws. They kept the code. These ancient so-called Atlanteans, they kept the code and had a mind well disposed toward their parent deity, the Most High, for their thoughts were true and grand in every respect, using meekness and prudence in everyday occurrences, and towards one another. They despised all temporal things but virtue, and they considered as rather a burden the plenty of gold and the abundance of other possessions. Neither did they, satiated with food, fall into error as unable to govern themselves because of their riches. But moderate as they were, they plainly saw that all those goods increase through mutual charity and virtue, and on the contrary, that through the desire and esteem of them, these virtues are destroyed. Through such principles, and the divine nature still lasting, all things improve for them, as we said before. But after the divine portion had been reduced to naught in them by the admixture of much mortal and human customs had prevailed, then they first became disgraced, being unable to bear transitory things, and appeared despicable to one who could observe having lost the most beautiful part of what is most honorable. All right? Who were they describing right there? Come on now. Just read the Old Testament. These remarks of Plato are certainly as great thoughts as those which he grants to the ancient Atlantides, and had he written the second half of his Critias, we might expect to find in it that the shameful loss of primeval righteousness brought them down to an unjust ambition, which was the cause of their punishment at the hands of the Athenians and of the gods, as it is related by the priests of Sais at the end of the philosopher's 20 miles in this manner, all right? They fell off, right? They stopped keeping the code. And you see what happened, right? The Atlantic kings, having combined all their strength, undertook one day to enslave at one swoop all your country and ours, and all that lies on the side of the strait. Then, O Solon, through the courage and power of your people, became evident to all men the importance of your city, for excelling all others in audacity and in the arts of war, either at the head of the Greeks or facing alone the calamity, while the others fled before it. She underwent the most extreme dangers, but having conquered at last, she erected a trophy of the arms of her assailants, preserving from slavery those who were not enslaved yet, and generously liberating all others who were living on this side of Hercules' boundary. Afterwards, extraordinary earthquakes and floods took place. The calamity lasted one day and one night, and your warlike apparel suddenly sank down in the earth, and the island Atlantis likewise disappeared, engulfed by the ocean. Hence, has that sea become impervious and impassable even now, sailing being prevented by its great shallowness, which was caused by the mud left behind by the sunken island? Although upheavals and depressions of the crust of the earth are well known facts, yet it is but recently, says Bancroft, that any important signification has been attached to this striking statement of the great Athenian philosopher. True, it had been frequently quoted to show that the ancients had a knowledge more or less vague of the continent of America, but no particular value was set upon the assertion that the mysterious land was ages ago submerged and lost in the ocean. Of late years, however, it has been discovered that traditions and records of cataclysms similar to that referred to by the Egyptian priests have been preserved among the American nations. And this discovery has led several learned and diligent students of New World lore to believe that, after all, the story of Atlantis, as recorded by Plato, may be founded upon fact, and that in bygone times there did actually exist in the Atlantic Ocean a great tract of inhabited country, forming perhaps part of the American continent. All right, it didn't all sink. This is what I've been trying to tell you. We still here. It was that big. This theory is today sustained by many scientists who conclude from the comparison of the flora and fauna of both hemispheres that America and Africa must have been close neighbors, while others, after studying deep sea soundings as carefully as sea captains do, arrive at the same conclusion. From the fact that the whole bed of the Atlantic, where the Atlantis island is said to have been situated, consists of extinct volcanoes, and is by the side of the Azores, the Madeiras, the Canary, and the Cape Verde Islands. Shout out to all my Cape Verdeans out there. You're just the top of the mountains of Atlantis that went down, dotted with reefs so numerous that it has all the appearance of a depressed mountainous country. The existence at some former period of such an island, or rather continent, seems to be regarded by geologists as a well-attested fact. These arguments would hardly fail to bring conviction should the evidence of Plato be strengthened by that of other ancient authors. But the testimonies of these only go to confirm his general statements regarding the Western world. Aristoteles, Plato's contemporary and his equal, if not his superior in philosophy, clearly speaks of our continent, and his description thereof added courage to Christopher Columbus. Listen, Christopher Columbus, so-called Salvador Fernandez Sarco, the Portuguese Jew, he knew about the Americas. He wasn't lost, guys. Get rid of that thought. He knew, he read Aristotle and Plato's, he knew, and searching the old route to it, as it admitted by ancient and modern authors. The possibility of meeting land by sailing westward from the western coast of Africa is sufficiently pointed out in the last lines of the second book, in chapter 14 of his Treatise on Heaven. He is of the opinion that the intervening distance is not extraordinarily great, and speaks of the elephants that were common to the opposite coasts of both continents. Elephants in America! I've been trying to tell you. It is said, he further writes, that the Carthaginians have discovered beyond the Pillars of Hercules a very fertile island, which, however, is devoid of inhabitants, thus the hijack, but full of forests and navigable rivers, and abounds in fruit. Where's the Carthaginians really from? Huh? It is situated many days' voyage from the mainland. Some of the Carthaginians, charmed with the fertility of that country, conceived the idea of getting married and of going to establish themselves there. But it is said that the government of Carthage forbade anyone to attempt to colonize the island under the penalty of death, for in case it were to become powerful, it might deprive the mother country of her possessions there. Theophrastus, the former philosopher, disciple, notices the same western lands. Theopompus not only mentions the, there's the book name, that lies beyond the ocean, which encircles the old world or the main continent, right? But his Silenus tells Midas, king of Persia, of the populous cities to be found in it, one of them having more than 1 million inhabitants. I mean, this is what they're finding today, right, with their lighter technology and the Amazon and the Petén region in Guatemala and Mexico, Yucatan. This is what they're finding. Cities that had more than millions, that had millions of inhabitants. He tells of its large animals and of its people who are twice as tall. Right? What did they find in the mounds, guys? Come on now. What did they find? The skeletons in the mounds, 7-footers, 8-footers, 9-footers, who are twice as tall and live twice as long as we, who have peculiar customs and laws quite different from ours, and possess great quantities of gold and silver, which they value less than we do iron. He also tells of their European exploration, as we shall observe hereafter, okay, of Americans, these tall, mound building, right, going over there to Europe, exploring Europe. An illustrious navigator of the 4th century BC, a contemporary of Theopompus, gives us evident proof that the farther we recede, either in time or space, from ancient Oriental literature, the less information we can expect from European authors in regard to our Western Hemisphere. We descend a river whose waters grow less and finally get lost in its sandy bed. All right? And that's the end of this chapter, guys, just like that. I mean, if you're not convinced yet, guys, after all these years, at least this chapter should help you open up your mind. All these ancient people knew, and we're talking about the Americas. And what else, that other book we've been reading, Researches into the Lost History of America, literally telling you the same. All that mythology was geographical locations and real people of the Americas. Come on, it's the same thing here, right? What did we learn yesterday, right? Poverty Point, industrial zone of copper, right? They were sending that copper all over the world. That's where you got your Bronze Age. Come on now, corn, maize, turkey, all this stuff that came out of the Americas. The so-called gods brought to the other people, so-called gods, right? Right. But I hope you guys, enjoyed this deep, deep chapter. I told you this book gets pretty good and it gets even better as it keeps going. That's why I wanted to go ahead and start reading this book chapter by chapter to you. Hope you guys enjoying the reading. I'm gonna go ahead and create the playlist as well, for these for this book we're reading, these chapters, because there's 2 volumes we're gonna be reading. And so this is, I believe, the 3rd or 4th chapter we read in this book. So, this was a deep, deep chapter, more proof, more corroboration. America is the true old world. Many ancient people, many people from the colonial times, these explorers, these colonists, these conquistadors were telling you. All these so-called Greek authors were telling you. A lot of these ancient people, these so-called priests from Egypt, from America, were telling the so-called Greeks. It's just abundant once you really start doing real search and not biased and stuck on one side of the earth, or biasly just choosing to ignore all this information, all this research we've shown in the last 8 years, over 1,000 presentations now. Over 1,000 presentations. We're going to add this one to it. Man, this was a great reading. I really enjoyed reading this with you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the time, to stay with me, sit down and hear what I'm reading, hear what I got to say. It's not just my theories, as you guys can see. It's many, many people's facts, not theories, facts and knowledge of what they knew of ancient America. All right. Again, chapter 5 of the history of America before Columbus. Hope you guys enjoyed it, really. Thanks for tuning in if you were here in the live chat or watched it later on. I appreciate you guys. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.